Good afternoon, class. This is Mr. Marks. I'm doing my first run through of guided notes to try to help you all out. I think that this may be a little bit easier than me standing up in front and talking to everyone at one time. So let's go ahead and begin. These notes will be Native Americans 2. You can just follow along, and because this will be a video, be nice and easy to just pause if you need any extra time. Our central question will be the same as what it was before. What does it mean to be American? And what I want to make sure is getting all this basic information down. Just in case you lose your paper, we can always replace it. So this is going to be page 6 in your notebook. Make sure you put that in a circle. Put your name. Just put mine. Your homeroom, you can just abbreviate, put HR. And then if you're in my homeroom, it'll be 29. Or if you're in Miss Carabrock's homeroom, that will be homeroom 30. Let's go ahead and begin now with our notes. So I'm going to have a lot more space here because I'm typing, whereas you are all going to be writing it out. So we're going to do our best to fit it in, but I'm going to kind of introduce you to this system of organization. So what I'm going to do for notes, I'm going to use Roman numerals to show the main headings, and then I'll be using letters to break it up. And what you can do later on is you can use small numbers to break it down further, and then small letters. But we're just going to start with the main two of just the Roman numerals and then the big uppercase letters. So I'm going to be starting off. First topic is before Europeans. So keep in mind, life was very different for Native Americans before the Europeans. So I'm just going to use some basic facts now for before Europeans. When we're talking about natives, Native Americans, they lived in all environments. So that's going to be lots of terrain, deserts, plains, mountains, Arctic, jungles, forests. So understand that Native Americans were very, very spread out. They lived just about everywhere on the continent. So now, our next point, we want to make sure that we mention they use natural resources to make all of their possessions. So, just to highlight, we're bringing up some of our terms that we've used before. So an environment is an area with natural resources. When you talk about the environment, it's the climate, it's the water, what plants are in the area, and these are the examples of the different environments. Natural resources, those are the things that you find inside the environment. So is it certain plants that can be used to make clothing? Is it trees that you can then use to build houses? Those are all examples. C. So hunter-gatherers and farmers. When we talk about Native Americans, they were both. Some just hunted and gathered, others developed agriculture and had big towns that arose up. When we talk about Native Americans, they were really in balance with nature. They worshipped a lot of animals, spirits. So we're going to just describe this and say they believed in being balanced with nature. Okay? So, yes, it's okay to use bison, but you don't want to hunt them all and kill them all off. Yes, it's okay to take some salmon from the rivers, but don't take them all, because then you're going to eliminate all of the salmon and there won't be any salmon left. And this is going to be our final point for our beginning of before Europeans. We want to say that there were many cultures and they were very diverse. So diverse in this case is going to mean that there were lots of different kinds of natives, okay? They weren't all the same. So let's skip a line so it'll be a little easier to read. Now Roman numeral 2, this is going to be our second category. And what we want to do, we're going to talk about this diversity within native cultures. So we're going to just go through some of the different areas. And I could have made this really long, but hopefully it's a little bit shorter and easier for all of us. So first, we're going to talk about Pacific Northwest. So let's bring up our regions. There's lots of ways that we can chop up the United States. This is going to be the Pacific Northwest. So along the ocean, lots of rainfall here, really wet. So that's going to influence the way that these peoples lived. So our first point that we're going to make is that they used the ocean, rivers, and forests for supplies, for their goods, to get what they need to survive. Our second point, let's talk about some of the things that they hunted. So, hunted. Let me scroll down for you too. So, they hunted whales, deer, bear, and salmon, which I mentioned earlier. Next point. Let's talk about how they lived, or what they lived in. So because there's a lot of rain in the Pacific Northwest, they were able to make these big houses out of wood. And they could use stone tools and cut it up, the trees, and make them into planks, and erect these really large houses out of it. Okay? That's what we need to know about the Pacific Northwest for Native Americans. Let's talk about California. In California, these are the natives I know a lot more about. So some things that they ate: salmon, shellfish, deer, rabbit, and duck. Okay, that's the meat that they would get. But the big thing for California natives was acorns. So many used tools to grind up acorns. That is something you'll definitely need to know for any test that we have, because throughout California you can go and you can find these really weird looking holes, and this is what they would use to actually grind up the acorns. Let me shrink this a little bit so you can see. They'd put the acorns in these holes. They'd then have a big stone that they'd then use to smash and grind it up. And they'd make like a little paste out of it, which they could eat. They could cook it, do all sorts of fun things to it to make it a little bit more edible. So people at this time in California didn't eat all these sugary foods, and they had really, really nice teeth. But their teeth would be chipped because there would be little rocks that would break off and get into the acorns, and it would chip their teeth. So just something kind of interesting about California natives. But you gotta know this. They ate acorns. Alright, what else about California natives? Their clothing. They wore clothes made of plants, and houses out of sticks. Okay, real simple houses. And what they would do for their clothing, they would just make it out of plants. That meant if it got dirty, if it got grimy, if you didn't want to wear that anymore, you could just throw it away. You could just burn it and make yourself new clothes. It was kind of a neat way of doing things back then. Let's move on. Let's talk about the Great Basin. So chances are you're probably wondering, where's the Great Basin? That's going to be kind of in this area here. So it's much more dry, more deserts. So, Great Basin. What's important about these natives? There's going to be few people who can live in the deserts and dry lands. They lived in temporary homes. And they kept moving. And this makes sense because if it's drier, if there's less water, you gotta keep moving. What else? Hunted and gathered, depending on the seasons. And this makes sense. You follow the rain. You stay by the rivers when they're full, and you leave when they dry up. Okay? Something else I'll add is that they had to store their food. Had to store their food for winter. Okay? If you keep food all year long, you're going to survive during times where there is not a lot of food. So that's what the Great Basin peoples would do. 5, southwest. Okay, let's go back. Let's look. Where's the southwest? Southwest would include parts of California, Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, and Utah, and even into Texas. And this is a large desert area, so similar to the Great Basin, but a little bit different. Let's talk about some of those differences. So once again, little water, but some were able to grow a lot of food. But some grew corn, beans, squash. Okay? They developed irrigation that allowed them to grow lots of food. What else? And this is kind of the cool part. They made houses out of adobe brick and wore cotton clothes. Now remember, the Californian natives just made their clothes out of plants. These guys and gals were able to grow cotton to make clothing, kind of like modern clothes. Their houses, let me show you a picture. This would be something more like what a Californian native would make, just out of sticks. This is what the Southwest Indians, natives, would use. This is Mesa Verde. I actually know a ranger working there currently, but they would build these big mud brick structures that they could then live in. So, pretty cool. Alright, what else about them? That's going to be it for the Southwest. I promise you, we're not going to do too many more. So 6, Great Plains. I'm guessing that by now you've probably ran out of space on the front page, so you can always use the back page. Oops. I'm just going to tighten mine up so that I will have enough space. So what is important about the Great Plains? Let's first show you where the Great Plains are. That's going to be kind of all this area here. Okay? Great Plains, which was a giant grassland. And what would live in the big grasslands? Bison. And I know that I've shown you pictures of the great American bison here, sometimes known as the buffalo. And the Great Plains Indians hunted these guys. Now later, they would get a tool from the Europeans that they could use to hunt the bison. And that tool was the horse. Keep in mind, before Europeans contacted with Native Americans, there really wasn't anyone who had the wheel. There weren't large domesticated animals, so no sheep, no goats. Well, they had wild goats, but no domesticated goats, no cattle, and no horses, no dogs even. Now, some were able to train wolves or coyotes that were kicked out of their packs, but they had to be very skillful to hunt and gather their food at this time without the aid of other animals and tools like guns. So for the Great Plains, they followed and hunted bison. They would use spears at this time, They'd have to sneak up on them, wait for the bison. Sometimes they would scare them off of a cliff, and the bison would run off the cliff, fall off the cliff, and die. And they could use spears to finish off the ones that didn't quite die. But they used all parts of the bison for food, clothing, shelter, so to live, and tools. Let's talk about some of these. All the parts of the bison. So food, obviously, they would get the meat from the bison. Clothing, they would skin it, they'd make their clothes out of it. Shelter, once again, use the skin. They could make teepees that could then be transported so that they could follow the bison herds. Tools, they could use the bones to make any sort of tool, basically. Knives, cooking utensils. They could use the tail for whips, things like that. Horns. Horns could be used to make cups. Some even would use horns of animals like the bighorn sheep to even make bows and arrows out of, which was pretty cool. Moving on, this is our last section, I promise you, and that's going to be the East. So I'm just going to put, I'll just put East. 3 points to make for the East. So forests provided supplies in the north. Okay? And they also built long houses. I already talked about long houses before. Let's jump back here just to make sure that you understand. This is the East. Notice there's the Northeast or New England, and then there's the Southeast. Just talking about the North, there's lots of forests here. They can hunt deer, they can hunt beaver, they can use those skins to make things like moccasins, lots of rivers, lots of trees. They can cut down those trees. They can make canoes and sail them to help fish and get all other sorts of supplies. Then there's the Southeast. The Southeast is swampland. So very different from here, up north, more swamp down here. And that's going to make some differences between these two geographical areas that we're looking at. So that's the north. Oh, also, in the north, women owned the land, and they were the farmers. The men didn't own the land, it was the women. Kind of interesting. That's completely different from what the others would do. In Europe, the men always owned the property. And our last point, swamps provided supplies in the south. And what did they build? They built large mounds. Okay, so swamps, lots of water, lots of nutrients to grow lots of different kinds of plants. Corn, squash, beans, all the usual ones that we see other natives growing. And this is kind of a mysterious point. In the South, they were known for making these large earth mounds. They would just pile up dirt and make them bigger and bigger. Sometimes they were shaped in the form of like serpents or birds. Other times they're just big piles of earth. And we don't really know exactly what they were used for. but that's going to be unique to this area. In fact, that's so unique, I'm just going to highlight that. Let me see where my highlight tool is. Actually, not here. I'm just going to make that in red, because that's kind of an important point. I want to make sure that we know that. When we talked about California, I can do the same thing. Acorns. I'll make that a different color. Okay? Those are pretty important things. Longhouses. It's almost as if we're finding really important things that might be on a test. So, those are just a few. What I want to do now is I want to jump up here and let's practice writing some questions. Now, keep in mind, the whole point of this section, the whole point is to think about on our notes, what are some things that might appear on a test? And I've just mentioned a few of them. So, another one I want to make sure that we see. For Great Plains, they use the bison. So I'm going to kind of generalize, and I'm going to say, what were some important food sources to Native Americans? Okay? And you could look at that for different areas. So we could expand that and say, what were some important food sources? I'm going to change this to 4 Native Americans in their areas. So with that, for their areas, we could see that for the Great Plains, if you highlight this bison, you're going to know that that's something important. Acorns will be important for those in California. And I'm going to go a little further to Pacific Northwest. One of the big sources for them, salmon. Salmon and whales. So, water-based. Those are 2 big important sources of food for them. Okay, California. We have acorns. Great Basin, we didn't really mention anything, but I'm going to add rabbit, because the textbook mentions that rabbit was a big source of food for them. Okay? Southwest, corn. And the East, I'm not going to ask you about the East because they had lots of different kinds of food. Now, another question that we could ask is, what different kinds of houses did Native Americans live in? And let's reword this a little bit. What different kinds of houses did natives live? Let's say housing. We don't want to say live in their area. So what different kinds of housing did Native Americans use for their areas? So now let's pick a different color. If you've got a highlighter, you can use a different color highlighter. Because I'm just going to change this. I'm going to make it more of a blue. Okay? They didn't really live in the mounds, but I'm just going to keep that blue for now too, because that's a kind of structure they made. So longhouses, that's going to be for the east. Great Plains, I'll add that they lived in teepees. I'll change that to be blue. That way we can keep track of it. Southwest, adobes. Okay. I'm not going to talk about Great Basin, but houses of sticks. I'm going to bring up wigwam. Wigwam. Once again, spelling doesn't count. So wigwam, I'm going to make that blue so that we know that Californians lived in there. Okay? So those are some ways we can kind of organize our notes. Make them a little bit stronger, a little more clear. We're going to leave it at that for the 2 questions. When we go to the bottom for our summary. These are the most important parts of our notes. So that's what we're bringing out, the most important things, the key ideas. The key ideas here, I'm going to help you out because we're still working on writing summaries. So I'm going to say our summary will be Native Americans had many different ways of life, based on where they lived. Okay? So you can see it's very diverse. Lots of different ways to live. But I'm going to bring this back to a point we made at the very start. We want to make sure that we say that there were some similarities though. So, but all Native Americans shared a belief in living in balance with nature. And I think that those 2 sentences give a nice conclusion and summarizes our notes into easy sentences. So this was our first try at guided notes on Native Americans. Let me know how you think the video went. Maybe we can make some changes, try some different things, but I hope that helped.